Hey there, and welcome to Camera Dads, episode number 6. I am one of your hosts, Mr. Phil Ringsmooth, and across the internet with me, as usual, is my brother and co-host, Simon. How you doing, Simon?
Hello. Hi, Phil, and hi, listeners. I can't believe we've already gone. This is our 6th episode. That's pretty awesome, Phil. Way to go.
Been doing this for half a year now. That's crazy. It's a lot of fun. It's a
It
lot of fun. I
is.
like what we're doing.
I sure do. And I think we got a good topic tonight, and I think it'll be a good discussion. Hope our listeners like it as well. Phil, what's the topic?
So tonight we're talking about the two big types of lenses that it comes to shooting with DSLRs. You have prime lenses and you have zoom lenses. There's some other terms that get thrown around, and we'll try to hit on those too, but essentially those are the two main categories of lenses. So we'll kind of break those down and talk about what we use them for, what each is good for, and how each of us makes use of them. So Simon, can you go ahead and talk about, in sort of a couple of minutes, what is a prime lens and what is a zoom lens? What do these terms mean for someone who might just be getting started with this kind of thing?
You know, that's a good question, Phil. And I had no idea what these meant when I started getting more serious about digital photography. And as a teaser, by the way, we will make some recommendations near the end. So if you want to stick around to the end and hear what we have to say as far as what we think you should get, or some good types of lenses to get, we will be doing that. But yes, a good question, Phil. What is a prime lens? So a prime just means that the lens is fixed in terms of its focal length. It can't zoom, and that seems like a huge restriction because pretty much every camera today can zoom in and out. You can buy a pocket camera that zooms in and out. So why on earth would you want a lens for a fancy DSLR that can't zoom in and out? And that's the big question. Why would you get one of these lenses, a prime lens? So that's a prime, and a zoom lens is just a lens that does zoom in and out. And really, pretty much all camera lenses fall into one of those two categories, prime or zoom. So that's what we're going to talk about here.
If you remember last week's show at all, one of the things that I touched on was that when I got started with digital photography, I essentially bought the camera with the longest zoom I could find. And I didn't know what a prime lens was. And when you began to educate me a bit more, and we started talking about prime lenses, I kind of sat in the camp of, why would I want that? Exactly what you were just saying. Why would I want a lens that doesn't zoom? What good is that going to do me?
You know, Phil, it's funny you mentioned that because I went through the same process. I thought when I got more serious into digital photography, I thought I need a zoom lens because zoom lenses must be good. And the more you can zoom in, the better the camera is. And I had the same thought process.
Certainly a misnomer once you get into things, because zooming, the ability to zoom, does not equate to getting better photos. I think that's something that I certainly used to think that, for sure. I would get a camera with the longest optical zoom that I could find, and hoping, just sort of anticipating that the photos would be better, that I could take cooler photos, I could take long distance photos and things like that. Well, it turns out that wasn't always the case. And a lot of times I was disappointed with what I actually ended up getting when I thought that I would be getting something really cool.
You know, I think what you're saying is that experience mirrors that of a lot of people in our position, parents who want to get more serious about photography. Mobile phone just isn't quite cutting it. And so they look for a better camera. And that's what I got. In, I think, 2011, my wife and I got a little Panasonic ZS7 pocket camera. And one of the big selling points for me was it had a 12x optical zoom. And I thought, this is awesome. We're going to finally be able to take good photos. And it worked great on a trip to Washington, D.C. before our son was born. But then once our son showed up, boy, we were not satisfied with the quality of the photos. And I had no idea why, because we spent a couple $100 on this, what I thought was a really nice pocket camera. And honestly, it is a nice pocket camera if you know its limitations. But yeah, the lens zoomed. So why weren't my photos good? And you're exactly right. Longer zoom doesn't necessarily mean better photos. Why why would you buy a prime lens? What's the advantage of a prime lens that can't zoom in and out? There must be something, right?
Well, I bought a prime lens because you told me to.
Oh man. Well, gosh, thanks, Phil.
But I'll try to answer this as best as I can, and then you can maybe fill in some of the blanks or things that I don't quite get right. But the biggest advantage for me in getting a prime lens is the aperture that you can get with it.
Whoa, slow down. What is an aperture? What are you talking about?
Aperture science.
Oh, like in the Portal video games. Okay, got it now.
It's a thing for Portal video games. Yeah.
I'm on board.
Aperture is the amount of light that can come in through the opening. Am I saying that right?
Sort of.
I don't want to confuse anybody.
You're right. So it's like if it's raining out and you've got a funnel, like a funnel with a 10-inch opening, like the size of a dinner plate, versus a funnel with a small opening. The funnel with the big opening is going to let in more water. And the aperture simply refers to the size of the opening. And in a prime lens, you can let in a ton more light. It's like putting a bucket out in the rain with a massive opening or massive funnel on top. You're going to collect more rain that way, just like a lens with a massive aperture can let in more light. And that
what good is that for, someone just getting started with this, or someone who doesn't really understand the difference? What does it mean when I am letting in more light, but I still can't zoom with that lens? I guess
that's a good question.
Because that's one of the biggest differences between prime lenses, zoom lenses, is prime lens. Is it that they have a fixed aperture,
mm-hmm.
or that they have a?
They have a wider. They have a fixed focal length and a wider maximum aperture. They can go small.
That size of your bucket can get much larger on a prime than it can on a zoom lens.
Yeah.
So, but what does that really do for me when I'm trying to actually, what all I want to do is get a good photo? What really is the advantage of getting in all of that light when I can't zoom? Okay. And then when I can zoom, if I have a zoom lens, like what probably comes with your DSLR out of the box, but it doesn't let in as much light, why is that such a limitation?
So these are good questions, Phil. Photography, like a lot of things in life, is all about trade-offs. And when you get a lens that zooms in and out, one of the trade-offs is due to the optical properties of how the light is manipulated inside the lens. When you start zooming in and out, you lose the ability to let in a ton of light. And it's just it's a matter of physics. Lenses that zoom in and out have smaller apertures because of the way that that the elements inside the lens, the glass elements, are moving back and forth. Unless you spend thousands of dollars on a crazy expensive zoom lens, does have a large maximum aperture. But most people, most parents who want to get better family photos won't be doing that, at least not for a little while. So the lens that comes with most cameras is the standard basic lens. Like you go to Target, Best Buy, you buy a camera, it probably comes with what's called a kit lens, and it'll say 18 to 55 on the side, and that means it zooms out to 18 millimeters, and we can get into what that exactly means, but basically it zooms out to really wide, so you can stand in a room and get a picture of the whole room. 50 or 55 millimeters, which means it's more narrow, and you can kind of zoom in on just one person in the room. But there's also some other numbers on that lens, and it's going to say 3.5 to 5.6. What those numbers mean is when
you're talking about the focal length now, right?
I'm talking about the focal length is 18 to 55. So a focal length of 18 millimeters is zoomed way out. Focal length of 55 millimeters is kind of zoomed.
F doesn't. I'm thinking the F number.
Yes, the f-stop.
F does not mean focal length, and that's something that confused me for a long time. It is called
No, I know.
f-stop, and that's the number that you're talking about, where it says something like 3.6 to 5 point something, or
yeah, and no, this is all super confusing, and it's why a lot of people don't get it, and I don't blame you. I didn't get it. It took me a long time to understand this, but the standard kit lens, this 18 to 55 millimeter lens that comes with some of the cameras, the bottom line is it doesn't let in much light. The trade-off is you get to zoom a little bit, but the disadvantage is you end up using that little pop-up flash a lot, because when you're zoomed out to 18 millimeters, the biggest possible aperture you can get is, ready for this? Are you ready, Phil?
I'm ready.
F3.5.
F3.5.
That number probably doesn't mean anything.
A couple of years ago, that wouldn't have meant anything. No.
It basically means you have a smaller aperture. The thing with these numbers, it's reversed. If your number is small, like f2.8, f1.8, the smaller the number, the bigger
That's
the
actually,
aperture.
in kind of what we're talking about, that's better as far as getting in more light, because that number isn't bigger is better. It's actually a ratio, meaning the closer you are to 1.0, the more light you're going to get in through that.
Yeah, bingo. Exactly.
So
exactly.
And that's going to, the amount of light is really going to determine how good your photos actually look. So the difference, let's kind of talk about a comparison here between the starting point for a lot of people is going to be the kit lens that comes with your camera, the 18 to 55, and a starting point. The first step then with a prime lens might be a 35 millimeter or a 55 millimeter. Those are two pretty common places to get your first prime lens. And let's go with the situation of your kid's birthday party. And you're just at home. Well, one of the things right off the bat that you'll be able to do with that kit lens that's going to be much more difficult with the prime lens is just take a picture of the entire room.
Yeah, that's right.
Because you can zoom out and you've got the term is escaping me, but you can capture a much wider area. Of the room.
Yeah, you zoom out to 18 millimeters and you can capture the whole room, and it's awesome.
Yeah, and odds are you're just doing a kid's birthday party at home. You're going to have plenty of light anyway, unless you're in that particular situation. If you're talking about a picture of the kid blowing out the birthday candles and the lights are out, that's a photo that's going to be really difficult to get with a kit lens, because it's going to be so dark. It's going to be, when you take the shot and look at it later, it's going to be grainy, which is something that ISO is all about, but I don't think we'll probably get
that's a whole other podcast
ISO tonight. But you can adjust ISO settings to kind of compensate for some of that. But if you took the same photo of your kid blowing out the birthday candles, what I'm envisioning is in my head here is, you're really close to the cake and the kid's face is taking up most of the photo, and you just want that.
Oh yeah,
right?
I know
that
photo.
The candles are going around. That is a near impossible photo to get with a kit lens and do it well, because it's going to be dark. There's going to be a lot of motion in the flames and in the smoke. But if you try to do that with a prime lens and you get yourself in the right position, that's the key difference, is you have to physically move yourself back and forth to find the right position. You can't zoom with
and it's all about go ahead.
Let me finish that real quick. You're going to get a much, not necessarily just right off the bat, but you have the ability with that prime lens to take a much better version of that same photo, because you can let in so much more light the light that you've got coming from the candles is going to do a lot more good than it would with the kit lens. You're going to be able to get that tack sharp focus of just the candle flames, you know, and maybe if you want your kid a little bit blurry behind there, you can have so much more control over that with the prime lens, because you can control the aperture a lot more than you can with that kit lens.
Yeah,
but the flip side of that same coin is you can't take a full room photo unless you got a huge long room. You can't stand at one end of the room with a prime lens and take a picture of, you know, the kid and all of his friends standing on the back wall. You're going to be backed against the other side of the room, not being able to step back any farther, and you're not going to get all of them in there.
Unless you have a super wide angle prime lens, like a 24 millimeter prime lens, but most people don't. Those are pretty expensive and kind of a limited use case there. But you brought up a key word, Phil, which is control. The reason a kit lens won't get you that photo of that tack sharp photo of your kid blowing out the candles is because it simply does not have the ability to let in much light, because of the way the optical trade-off when you want to zoom in and out a larger aperture, you end up with a smaller aperture, especially if you're zoomed way in. If you're zoomed in as far as your lens can go, then you're going to have a really small aperture. And that means your camera's going to have to do something to compensate. Most of the time, that involves leaving the shutter open for a longer period of time, which results in a blurry photo. Because we all know how fast kids move. If I let my shutter open for a half a second, even like a tenth of a second, your kid's going to move a lot in 1/10 of a second. But your camera needs to let the shutter stay open. Aperture is so small and you're not letting in much light. But if you get a prime lens, go ahead.
Is the way to compensate for that in that case would be, this is kind of a question actually too, with a prime lens, in 1/30th of a second, because the aperture can be so much larger, in that 1/30th of a second, it would take me, I'm just making something up here, a tenth of a second or a quarter of a second to get the same amount of light in in an equivalent sort of manner using a kit lens, because the opening is so much smaller.
No, that's exactly right. And you can actually do the math on. Yeah, you can run the math on this. And if we get really complicated into f-stops, every stop of light is half as much light as the stop before it and all that. So you can run the math, and let's say you get a really nice picture of your kid, and you take it at 1/30th of a second, and you're shooting your prime lens with a really wide aperture. Well, on a kit lens or a zooming lens, you're going to need to let that shutter open for like a tenth or a fifth of a second, which is really, really slow. Or what I see a lot of times, which is you get ready to take that photo and that little flash at the top of your camera goes, and that the
which
reason
is kind of like a big red flag that you and I kind of cringe at seeing that happen.
Yeah, I kind of do.
We know it's just going to wash out everything in the photo.
Yeah.
But as a default for a lot of people just getting started, I mean, I used to do exactly the same thing. I've got thousands of photos that I just took with the flash because that's the way I thought it was done.
Mm-hmm.
And
oh yeah, it's totally common.
They're all washed out and they don't look good, but you know, I didn't know what I was doing. And so I thought, okay, well, you're going to use the flash to get a bunch of light in there, and that's going to take care of that problem.
Mm-hmm. And it goes back to those trade-offs. Photography is all about capturing light. I mean, like, you can go back 100 years and the entire history of photography is all about capturing light. And if you don't have enough light, you got to do something. Either let your shutter open for longer or put more light in there with a little pop-up flash. Or you can get really complicated, raise the ISO and things like that. But our whole discussion of prime lens versus zoom lens, the trade-off you get with a zoom lens is you get these smaller apertures, which means you can't let in as much light. which if you're a parent out there and you want to know why that flash keeps popping up on your camera, it's because you're probably using a zoom lens of some kind, and so your camera has to add more light with that little pop-up flash, and then you get what you're talking about. The photos are kind of washed out, and maybe your kid is all kind of well lit, but everyone behind is kind of shadowy and dark because the flash can't reach that far. So you get these trade-offs again. But if you get a prime lens, like a 35 millimeter or 50 millimeter prime lens, then you have to use your feet to walk back and forth. And if you're at that birthday party, you're going to be like, you can cancel your gym membership because you're going to spend that whole party huffing and puffing as you're running around trying to get these photos, because you can't just zoom in and out. And so I think, Phil, I'm going to go on a limb here. I think we would both say that neither type of lens is better. They're just different types of lenses, and they both have their places, and they're good for different things. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, certainly. Absolutely. Neither one is better. So the idea isn't necessarily prime lens versus zoom lens. It's just they each have their advantages and their disadvantages. And one thing I think was interesting, and this actually ties in with our last episode about vacation photography. This year, because you and I just took a family vacation with our extended family and all of our kids and stuff at a lake, just a cabin on a lake for about 3 days. Mm-hmm. And I spent, like 80% of my photos from that trip were taken with my kit lens. Even though I
was surprised by that. I didn't realize.
I was happy when you were surprised by that. After looking through some of my photos, you were.
Yeah. I was looking through Phil's photos and I was like, oh man, I bet I can figure this one out. And I would text Phil, I'm like, oh, you shot this with your 35. And he's like, nope, that was my kit lens. Oh man. All right. So I'd look through another one. Oh, clearly this one, you'd see the shallow depth of field. This had to be your 35. And he'd be like, nope, kit lens. And I was like, man.
Yep. Almost
I don't even have a kit lens. I got to get me one of those.
Well, a lot of what you were looking at, Simon, was outdoor photos in the middle of the day on the beach, tons of sunlight. You can't get any more light than what we had. Mm-hmm. So that's a good point. Didn't necessarily need to have the prime lens for the purpose of having enough light to get that good photo. Mm-hmm. So I just brought the kit lens with me, and I was able to position myself, to get just enough I needed, to get the photo that I wanted without having to move back and forth or zoom with your feet, as it's commonly called.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean,
I was very surprised how well I did with the kit lens at the lake this year.
And if you've got a situation where there's a ton of light, then a kit lens is great because you don't need to worry about not having enough of it. It's when the sun goes down and you're at the beach with your kids and you can see the sun on the horizon, or you're inside with your family or something. Or if you've got a small child and you don't want to be flashing that camera flash in your baby's eyes. I mean, my friends here in town just have a newborn. He's like less than a week old, and they don't want to be blinding their little baby with the camera flash all the time. Those situations are when it's fantastic to have a prime lens, because you can take these pictures in such low light by letting in so much more light compared to what you might be used to on a prime lens. And if you look at the f numbers, we mentioned f-stop on a kit lens, it's like 3.5 to 5.6. On a 35 millimeter prime lens, which by the way is what I recommend to pretty much anyone who's going to get into photography, is a 35 millimeter prime lens. On a lens like that, it's really common to have an f1.8 aperture. And as Phil, as you mentioned before, the closer to 1 you get, the bigger the opening gets. f1.8 is massive. You can take pictures with like candlelight, and you don't need a flash. I mean, it's crazy what this whole amount of photography possibilities opens up that was never there before. and you have so much more control, like you mentioned, over your photos, because you can decide how much light to let in when you're using your lens.
Yeah, I remember when I first bought my 35 millimeter prime at your recommendation. It was, gosh, it was the day before my son's 5th birthday party, which we were having at a bowling alley. And I thought that a bowling alley wasn't going to be supremely well lit.
Mhm.
It's often the case that bowling alleys are not, super bright, especially if you're there later in the evening. They're a darker place, and so I was able to use that 35 millimeter prime to get a lot better shots. But I was doing a ton of zooming with my feet.
Yeah, and it's always that trade-off.
But I'm thinking back to the vacation situation and some other situations on the exact same trip where it would be really difficult to get a good photo with the kit lens like I was using, would be a campfire.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you're having a campfire in the middle of the day, it's dusk, which, crazy grandpa sitting by the fire all day. But
we don't know anyone like that, do we?
It's no, nobody.
Phil and I just got off from family vacation.
From about dusk onward, you're sitting around the campfire, you're making s'mores. You are going to have a really difficult time getting any good pictures of your kids in that situation with a kit lens, because it's just going to be too dark.
Mm-hmm.
And if you try to compensate for that by leaving the shutter open a little bit longer, we're talking, the difference between a 30th of a second versus a 15th of a second,
which is huge,
or a 60th versus a 30th.
Yeah.
If you're in the 20th, 15th, 10th, you're basically taking a movie.
Yeah, a lot of movement happens in that small amount of time.
So you really got to, I try not to go below a 30th, and if I'm doing anything with any kind of motion, I'll go a 60th, a 100th, a 200th, or smaller or faster. But at the campfire situation, if you try to get a good photo of your kid, with holding the marshmallow stick over the fire, and you try to do that with a kit lens, it's either going to be too dark, or it's just going to be really blurry. You're going to have
that flash going to pop up and ruin the whole thing.
Oh, yeah. Which used to be me. Absolutely used to be me. And then you've got, it's not dark anymore. Everybody's just bright white because of that flash, and then nobody can see for.
And you get the red eye, like the red eye in people's eyes, and you got to fix that in afterwards. And it's a mess.
If you have a DSLR, and this is a bit of a blanket statement, but if you have a DSLR and you're taking photos and that flash pops up, it's almost like a warning that says, hey, you're doing something wrong, because this photo is not going to turn out the way you think it is. And by the camera springing up the flash, it's trying to say, hey, maybe reconsider what you're trying to do here.
We don't have enough light. Photographer, you need to fix this. As we're talking about this, there's when my son was when he was born, and I mentioned that pocket camera, we had that little Panasonic pocket camera, which we still have. My photos weren't the same quality as others I saw online, or things like my friends would post on Facebook. And then I think I probably told the story on Camera Dads before. My buddy Kevin came over and he showed me his Nikon D200 camera with a 50 millimeter prime lens, which is a little tight for my taste. I now shoot a little wider than that. But along with letting in a bunch of light, there's other benefits to a prime lens too. And again, I'm not saying a zoom lens is bad. In fact, I think zoom lenses are great if you know why you're getting them. But when you can when you shoot with a wider aperture, then you can experience this whole new world called shallow depth of field. And That's
I was waiting
when,
for you to bring up the word bokeh.
it's on my notes.
I think it's coming. I think it's coming.
Shallow depth of field is that photo that you've seen times online where the kid or the flower or the car or the object is perfectly sharp and in focus, but the background is super nice and blurry, and it's just got this pro magazine cover style quality to it. And you're shooting with your pocket camera, you're shooting with your mobile phone or something, and you might be thinking, there's some magic to this. There's no way I can get that because my photos always have that little pop-up flash and my backgrounds don't get blurry like that. Well, when you shoot with a wide aperture, it's because of the properties of light and the way light interacts with that wider opening that you can get your kid tack sharp and everything else super blurry. And for me, this was like a revelation. And I still have these early photos of my son where Kevin came over to our house and he showed me with this prime lens. And keep in mind, up until then, I was like you, Phil. I was like, we want a camera. I want a zoom lens because zoom lenses are great. And Kevin's like, no, you want a prime. And Ryan, my other friend who's helped me convince this, he's like, no, you need a prime lens, but you can't zoom. So Kevin comes over, takes a few pictures of my son, and instantly I was hooked. I realized that this shooting with a wide aperture, suddenly we could get the types of photos I had never thought possible. And there was no magic to it. All you needed was a lens with a big old aperture. And suddenly you can control depth of field, and you can have a very shallow depth of field, which results in a bokeh in your background, which is bokeh is just that term that means out of focus area. And hold on just a second. Yes.
Speaking of dads.
Okay, go ahead.
We're having a technical difficulty with the child.
Yeah, my son just got out of bed. I'm sorry, listeners. I might have to help him a little bit here.
If you have to bail, we can bail. But
okay.
I was going
to. So for parents, for any parents out there who want to get better photos of their kid, and they're wondering, why is the flash always up? Why can't I get the shallow depth of field that I see in magazines and on Facebook? And it's going to, like, you're going to level up 2 or 3 levels, and you're going to achievement unlock.
Absolutely.
So
if you're considering this, and here's something that we haven't talked about yet is the cost of this equipment, of this gear. A 35 millimeter prime lens is going to set you back about $200, and a 55 millimeter prime lens, which is just a longer focal length, so that the distance that you are going to be in focus with is going to be farther away than with that 35. That's even more expensive, right? $250 or $300.
Yeah, it's something like that. Yeah,
just generally.
If you shoot, I do want to pause for a second. It varies from camera to camera. Canon actually has a really good 50 millimeter lens for like $125, brand new.
Okay, no idea. That's great.
Canon also has a 24 millimeter prime lens. Nikon doesn't. Nikon has a 35 f1.8. Canon's got a 24 2.8. But what you're saying is true in that a lot of these primes are about in that price range of like about $200 or so.
So that's, for a lot of people, that's half the cost of the camera that you just bought.
Yeah, man.
You buy a DSLR for $350 or $400 on a good sale, and now you want me to go and spend $200-$300 more on a lens? Well,
I know what you're saying.
That's a scary step to take. If you're doing just fine with your kit lens, like I was, or I thought I was when I got started, would you say, like, I'm trying to think of a good way to maybe recommend taking that step without buying it. One thing about DSLRs is that you can swap the lenses. So if you have a buddy or a family member that has either the same brand of camera that you do, or has a lens that's compatible, then you may just be able to borrow that. I used to work with a couple of great photographers. Ben Hollingsworth was one of them. We had him on the show a couple months ago. I think he shoots Canon. And I have Nikon, so of course I'm able to borrow his lenses. But that's a great scenario. Like, okay, hey, we work together and you're way better at photography than I am. I'm interested in this prime lens thing that I heard about on the greatest camera photography podcast in the world, Camera Dads. And, but I don't want to spend $200. Can I borrow your lens? Like, can I bring my camera to work someday? And you just bring your lens, you know, and we'll go out in the parking lot and take some photos. That would be a fantastic way.
And someone like Ben
to feel
they're probably going to be thrilled to do that, because a lot of photographers like explaining things, and if you have a buddy like that, they're probably going to be thrilled that you're asking and want to know more. My wife actually brought up something good when I was talking to her about all this. And Phil, did I lose you? Are you still there? I can't hear Phil. Hmm. Hey, you. Hey, you. We're done, so Phil's Wi-Fi stopped working.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it just like crapped out on them. We only had a few minutes left. We're just about to do our recommendations. And we can just do it on Sunday.
Oh, like,
I'll see if he can bring it. Mike to mom and dad's if they can make it. Just go downstairs for a couple minutes and finish it up. Anyway, we're done.
okay. Sorry, I bet.
Oh, that's okay.
Hey there, and welcome to Camera Dad's episode number 6, part 2-ish. I'm Phil, and with me is Simon. And if you're wondering what happened, we had some technical difficulties. Let's just put it that way.
Phil's internet died, and it wasn't his
They
fault.
pulled the plug on my internet right in the middle of our show, towards the end of our show. So we've been trying to get things up and running again. And so here we are, dedicated to our massive fan base of photographic fathers out there. So, Simon, when we got cut off last time, we were talking about some recommendations for different kinds of lenses.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go ahead and sort of put off on what you were thinking about there?
Yeah. So right as we left off, I was about to make a point that my wife sort of made to me as she and I were discussing this topic and some things that I might want to talk about. And she mentioned something that I don't often think about, which is we've talked a lot in this episode about a lot of the different pros and cons for prime lens versus zoom lens. And she made the point that a lot of this depends on the kinds of photos that you want to take. And zoom lenses are great if you have older kids who are not close to you a lot of times, like they're in sports or they're running around or they're doing something where they're not necessarily close to you, like they're riding their bikes or they're in plays. The smaller aperture that you get on a zooming lens typically is okay if you've got plenty of light. And Phil, you've got like a 55 to 250 or 200.
Yeah, 55 to 200.
And it's fine if you've got plenty of light and the kids are your kids are in soccer, I think, or baseball. Is that right?
Yeah, both actually. And we did, episode 2 or 3, 4, or something like that was on all about sports photography.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I use my zoom lens for, almost primarily, exclusively, is for sports photography. Soccer.
Yeah, it works great for that.
Baseball. It didn't work so well for basketball, and that was indoors. And that's a case for the prime lens. Or maybe a kit lens because you're confined. You can't. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. You can't really get as wide as you need to indoors in a small environment if you've got a zoom lens.
Mm-hmm.
So
and they do make these like 18 to 250 or 18 to 300 zoom lenses, but they're a little more expensive. You're looking at $500 for one of those. You can get like an 18 to 200, but you're going to have some trade-offs in that as well. But you're exactly right, Phil. If you're depending on the different situation that you're in, a zoom lens is fine. And if you're looking at a prime lens like 50 millimeter prime or a wider one like a 24 mil or something like that, they can be cheap, but they can be pretty darn expensive too. And the prime is not always worth the trade-off. I recommend primes because they're a good all-around lens. But if you have if you find yourself in situations with your kids where it's difficult for you to walk closer to them, there's a saying, zoom with your feet when you're shooting primes, but you can't always do that. So then a zoom is great. And honestly, we mentioned before we got cut off on part A that your friend from work, Ben, he talked a lot in his sports episode, and in the sports episode he was on, about some of the gear he uses. He's got a really nice zoom lens, a 70 to 200 zoom lens, f2.8. So you can use that indoors, and I have that same lens too. But man, is that thing heavy, and it's a huge trade-off. These trade-offs. And honestly, if I was to make a recommendation, it's always a 35 millimeter prime. But after that, I think it's a good idea to get yourself a kit lens or one of these like all-in-one 18 to 250 or 55 to 200 zoom lenses. I think there's a lot of use for that.
Let me throw a question at you.
Hit me.
Why does a camera come with a kit lens, 18 to 55? That's extremely common.
Mm-hmm.
And that lens, is that going to cover the majority of the bases for people getting started? Is that why that lens comes with, as opposed to, even a low end by price? I mean, prime lens, like a 35 or 55 prime.
So the answer to that, prior to like the mid 80s, there wasn't really such a thing as a consumer grade zoom lens. All cameras came with about a 50 millimeter prime lens. And it varied from camera to camera, but you go out and you buy a Nikon F3 or something like that, a film camera, and it would just come with a prime lens. And when zoom lenses started to be a little more practical, especially once autofocus was invented in the late 80s on consumer models, you started to get these zooms where you had this range, like 18 to 55 ish, and people started to be attracted to that simply because you could zoom in and out. And I think they've kind of stuck with that because modern cameras are so good at dealing with the limitations of the smaller aperture that you get in a kit lens. ISOs can be raised much higher today than they could in past years. And that's one way to combat the small aperture is you raise the ISO. Well, that usually ends up with photos with a lot of noise and they look muddy, but not as much anymore.
Yeah.
Because cameras are so good. So I think the kit lens, the 18 to 55 kit lens, it does a good job covering a variety of situations, but you lose out on that large aperture. And I think a lot of people get a kit lens, they get a camera with a kit lens, and then they get frustrated because their photos aren't transformed the way they thought they might be. Have that smaller aperture, so you don't get this shallow depth of field, you don't get the blurry backgrounds, and you have to use that flash a lot.
Yeah,
but
I can vouch for that myself
all-around.
Because when I upgraded to a DSLR and it came with the kit lens, let's see, it came with a kit lens and it was a package deal that also came with the 55 to 200.
Okay.
And that my photos weren't automatically so much better, like the ones you were taking, you being sort of my photographic mentor. They weren't pictures that you would get. And that's because I wasn't using the equipment that you were using. And I talked about earlier on this show how I was very surprised and very happy with how well I did with my kit lens on our vacation.
I was
a couple
too.
Weeks ago.
I thought you did a fantastic job with that kit lens.
Thank you. Very happy with the way that turned out. So I definitely still use it. It's not like I put it on a shelf and just exclusively go with the prime unless I'm at a sporting event. I guess it kind of depends on my mood or what's going on. I mean, before actually 2 days ago, we just had my daughter's first birthday. And so I couldn't talk about this on the other show on the first half because it hadn't happened yet.
So you planned this all
Oh, yeah,
along.
I pulled the plug just to get this in there. And I haven't gone through those photos yet, but I probably got a couple hundred photos. And I had the prime lens on all day because I didn't want to mess with anything. I knew that I was going to have the good light. I can just get down at her level because she's walking around and, so she's carrying whatever cups and plates and whatever babies are doing. And I just took pictures of everything with that prime lens all day long. And I didn't once think, man, I wish I had my kit lens on here. So it just really depends. For me, it depends on the situation. And sometimes just the decision I make at the time. Like, all right, I'm going to go on this thing. I'm going to take the prime with me this time. Just to see.
Phil, that's a great point. And I think as we kind of close out this whole episode, this 2-part episode, I think that what you just said is sort of a good way to summarize a lot of the things we've been making. Is there's no one answer, and it just sort of depends on the situation and your subject and your goals. And for me, it's getting the experience of using different lenses and different cameras over time. And I think it's good to have a kit lens. It's good to have a prime lens. It's good to have a zooming lens. But what you're saying about knowing what you want to use and knowing when to use it, I think that's really important. And honestly, I think that only comes with a lot of experience. So if someone is looking for a lens to buy right now, you could get a kit lens, you get a prime lens like we've talked about, but the important thing is to use it no matter what it is. Just use it and learn about apertures, learn about shutter speed and ISO. And then over time, you'll find yourself more comfortable with deciding what your next lens should be, or maybe how to use the lens you currently have more effectively.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's spot on.
I credit you for all the wisdom here, Phil.
Me too. All right. Do you have anything on what we are going to talk about next time?
I do indeed. Our next topic is going to be called the early days. And that's where Phil and I are going to talk about the way we got involved in photography, which, we've sort of mentioned in passing here and there throughout these past several episodes. But there was a time for both of us that we realized that mobile phones, pocket cameras weren't quite cutting it. And we wanted something more because our kids it was sort of our early days of serious digital photography and our kids' early days of life here on Earth. So we're going to talk a little bit about the camera gear that we bought to help us get better pictures. And also talk about the experience of what it was like to document those first few weeks of our kids' lives. So we'll talk about some techniques that we found useful and how our shooting styles changed over the years since our kids have been born. So if you've got a newborn or expecting a newborn, hopefully next podcast will be interesting to you.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that one.
Me too. So I'm looking forward to your internet not dying, which was not your fault. Just so our listeners are clear. The internet got shut off for like 1,000 people in Lincoln where you live because of some mess with the ISP. So
some bureaucratic corporate takeover of the little guys.
That's right. Yeah.
So, but we're all good. We're good now. So, all right. Well, thank you, Simon, for, meeting up for this sort of closing.
Hey, thank you, Phil.
Session here. Yeah.
Listeners, you might not realize it, but Phil has so much going on right now between birthdays and visitors from out of town, more visitors from out of town, another set of visitors from out of town, all within like a week. And I'm amazed, Phil, that you were able to find time to finish up this podcast. So thank you.
Yeah, I know what's important in life.
Casting. All right.
Podcasting. Yeah. All right. Well,
thank
you. And for everybody out there who's playing along, we encourage you to leave your thoughts on this episode, questions that you have about what we talked about, or any comments on what we're going to be talking about next time with that sort of getting started, our early days in all of this. You can find us at cameradads.com. We're facebook.com/cameradads, I believe. And you can find the podcast stuff there. You can find the episode on cameradads.com. Go to youtube.com and look for Camera Dads there and watch the videos of the podcast and leave comments there. And we will read your stuff on the air and, reply to you and have a great discussion. So thanks for playing along and listening. And it's been a good time. So,
All right. Okay. We'll see you later.
All right. Good night.